If you really want to understand how a business or a company works, you have to make sure you have some level of experience in the annual planning process. Considering I have been doing sales operations or supporting sales, as well as started out my career in sales before shifting into sales ops for over 20 years now, my philosophy on ops probably has shifted over the years, as has the situation with the market and what the ops function is about. And it's really about balancing a lot of needs that the business has, and in this case, it would be the sales organization that we support, while still trying to be proactive and strategic where we can. That is a very common challenge. I think sales ops or revenue operations focused professionals and leaders come across on an ongoing basis. And it's also aligned to the maturity of the organization, both the company, sales, as well as operations. And so understanding, maintaining that balance, depending on where your organization is currently, I think is key to helping you be successful in delivering what the business would like to see from a function such as sales operations.
Yeah, superb, with lots to unpack there. Love the fact you brought in challenging the day-to-day tactical with the strategic. But I want to go back to something you said, which is your approach to ops has changed through your time in doing it and in selling and with the landscape. I would love to understand a bit more about you and how much of this change has been internal and the reasons for this, and what growth opportunities you've thrown yourself into to change, but also what you've observed in the ops landscape in general that's facilitated a change in your mindset as well.
Sure. My first foray into operations, I think, starts even prior to being in operations directly as a functional role, but really being in a sales role. So way back when I started my career in inside sales, this is when I was at Symantec, it gave me a sense of what are things that I need to be successful in the role that I was in this case, sales. And so with that perspective, combined with my passion for ongoing learning and sharing the knowledge with others, which is really kind of training, education, development, all of that. My first foray into the ops side of the world back then was on the sales training side. So today we clearly differentiate and acknowledge the partnership with sales operations and sales enablement, which is just as much of a critical function that we need to think about. Back then, I think it was considered more sales training. And the reason why I mention my own career experience and entry into sales training as a significant turning point for me to really be where I am with sales operations is because sales operations really touches a lot of things to support the business, and having that partnership and understanding on the sales training enablement side is going to be key. And so when I started into a sales training role, and then eventually had the opportunity to manage a small project and learn some basic project management skills, and then next phase in my career was joining a sales project management office for PMO, and eventually really focusing in more of the core of what operations does around annual planning and sales compensation and forecasting and reporting. It is more of it was probably not an intentional career path, you could say, where I knew exactly what I wanted to do, that I want to be in sales operations and leading a sales operations team, which is where I am right now. It was more of as I went into these different roles, starting in a sales role, then training, then various roles, including change management, and eventually landing more squarely in what we would consider a sales operations role. It was more of a transition and progression based on where I was at, and my curiosity to learn and understanding how things are connected, how different teams work together. And one of the key impetus to really focusing on the annual planning aspect of operations teams, where we play a key role working with sales leadership on their go-to-market strategy and pulling an execution plan, was a guidance from one of the leaders that I truly admire, having had the opportunity to work with, who was then an SVP of sales and marketing operations. It still reminds me, and I share this in my coaching and mentoring engagements with others, is if you really want to understand how a business or a company works, you have to make sure you have some level of experience in the annual planning process, even if it's starting with sales. And the reason why is, while it might sound like a sales specific planning process, it is cross-functional. You have to understand what the marketing approach is. You have to understand where the product go-to-market is and the future roadmap. And then you also think about, when sales has a go-to-market, what is it going to take for us to execute against the plan from a process, system, tool support perspective, from a training perspective, from building the plan. So it actually exposes you to a lot of different aspects of how a company as a business operates, just by starting and exposing yourself to the annual planning cycle supporting the sales organization. And so that was one of the key nuggets, in a way, of wisdom that I gained having worked directly under an SVP of sales and marketing ops, that I to this day kind of reflect back on as something that has really helped me make that decision to get that experience in annual planning and sales compensation. So a little bit of a roundabout way, but hopefully that kind of summarizes why my philosophy in ops is the way it is.
Yeah, this is fantastic, actually. Interesting to note, speaking about annual planning as being cross-functional, this is obviously a huge buzz in ops right now. So the interesting thing there, Yuri, is lots of folks come through sales into ops. That's a fantastic route for people to take. And what strikes me about this is, as a seller, you're an individual contributor, you're executing on your own plan against your own targets. But what you've described there is such a cross-functional and beginning to be a strategic role.
Mm-hmm.
Annual planning awesome lens into this, Yuri, but there'll be plenty of reps going into ops who will be listening to this. And I'd love to hear more about, the steps they can take to understand thinking more broadly about those wider teams, and the change in mindset from executing against my plan to our plan.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think if you're starting from a sales perspective as an individual contributor, there are a couple of career trajectories, including going up into various sales management and leadership roles, or sales enablement or sales operations, or occasionally for ops roles, you may see people coming from sales finance side of the world, actually kind of going back and forth between the two organizations as well. But if you are one of the audiences listening that is in an individual contributor sales role, one of the things I would recommend that you look at is, one is, yes, you have your number, but understanding how your number contributes to the larger plan. It might be at your manager's level, where your manager has a number of reps that is responsible for some level of a territory, and then subsequently above. So I think it's important to step back a little to say, here's my number, here's what I need to get there. But how does my number contribute to the overall number that my leadership is looking at? I think it will help you think a little bit wider and more bigger picture as well. And if you start to understand, all right, so my manager cares about this, there may be certain things like, it's not just about the number, it's about what percent of what I'm bringing in is whatever product it might be, right? So understanding how you think about it at a higher level, I think will help you start to think from the lens of what sales operations teams look at, especially when we support the sales leadership with key processes like forecast reviews and pipeline reviews.
Okay, so it sounds like a seller needs to be aware of the space in which they occupy and how that relates to the wider whole. If they can do that for themselves, then they can do that in sales ops.
And also the other thing, which I think is very natural for sales reps as an individual contributor to be aware of, are what are the pain points you have in your current experience, especially when you look at internally what your experience is Is it clear what you're expected to do? Do we provide you with the tools to help you be successful? If you're aware of the pain points, I would challenge the listeners to think about recommendations versus just complaining about your pain points. And when you think about the recommendations and the reasons why you make that recommendation, you're already starting to think like an ops person as well, where you're thinking about process impact and systems and tools to consider, and a business case, quite frankly, for why we should consider those improvements. And the business case ideally is also tied to that bigger picture, which typically is related to targets or revenue or rep productivity. And understanding some of those key metrics when you think about taking a simple pain point you might have and thinking about, why do I want this to be improved? Because it helps me to be productive. And why do I want to be more productive and efficient? Because I can prospect more and spend less time on admin data entry in the system. And if I do that, I have X more hours to reach out to my customer, which can translate to other key metrics such as building pipeline or increasing my win rates because I'm spending more time with customers. It kind of helps you connect the dots. And that really is a mindset that ops looks out across metrics, taking one simple challenge that sales might have from a user perspective.
Okay, yeah. So you can adopt an ops mindset before you're even in the role. You bring up a crucial point there, which is understanding the pain points as a sales rep. Obviously, you mentioned you'd been a pain point, Yuri. But if you hadn't, sorry, if you'd been a pain point, sorry, you'd been a rep. But if you hadn't been a rep, is there a glass ceiling to how far you can ally and form partnerships with sales, for example? I imagine the answer might be no. So therefore, as well, as a leader, I'm really interested in how you build your ops team with different personality types and backgrounds to fulfill different functions, and what different backgrounds can serve in a team.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think each organization and sales operations team makeup and prior experience is going to vary. So if you have the sales experience, that's great because you understand the challenges personally. So you can understand why a certain request or a concern might be flagged from a rep or manager perspective. We call this in ops like the frontline experience in a way, because we also have to balance top-down executive level expectations, especially as it relates to reporting and metrics, right? If you don't have an actual personal experience working in a sales role, one of the things I highly recommend, which I would share with any team that I have, is if we are the experts based on our experience and skill set and what we're tasked to do in the current role we are in ops, whether you're a process person or a system or tool person or a data analytics expert, we obviously hire you into those roles with those expertise, right? If you're using SFTC as a CRM, or if we're using Tableau or Anaplan or whatever technology, right? It's good to have some of that technical skill set. And I would then challenge the team, if that is the background, let's say, you're the expert, so you should be able to provide recommendations based on the challenges brought forth by sales. And sometimes they may have a point of view on what the requirements should be or what tools we should consider because they are looking to improve it themselves. We should not hesitate to provide them with alternative recommendations based on expertise and understanding the business challenge. At the same time, I would coach my team to have these one-on-ones or shadow sessions with the sales team or the rep or the manager to familiarize ourselves with what exactly are those challenges instead of just responding to a request that is addressing a challenge. Because a lot of times what you will find is, hey, I need this report or I need this tool. You got to peel the onion and ask a lot of questions. Why do you need this tool? Help us understand what your current workflow is and where the gaps are and how would this tool support you? Does it automate things? Does it make things easier? Does it take away some of the admin work that you have to do today? So you can answer those questions, but what is even more powerful is if you can have the rep do like a day in the life of a sales rep type of a shadow session or walkthrough, and you'd be amazed how many things you can understand. And so that would probably be the second best recommendation if you don't have a rep experience yourself, to have those sessions with the sales organization.
Okay, I appreciate they're really practical tips. And this relates to what we discussed earlier, which is balancing the high level strategy with the day-to-day tactical and the fires. And that's something I wanted to return back to, Yuri. So this is one good way of doing it, which is what ask why, challenge. And then perhaps we don't need to react so often. We can find longer term solutions or something. But let's take it really big picture here. So, in your experience, what are some of the barriers or roadblocks that stop someone in ops or a team getting ahead of being proactive and thinking strategically and always being stuck in the day-to-day firefighting mode?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I'll caveat it with, it's easy to recommend it as a best practice of balancing reactive and proactive to be more strategic. I myself personally probably go into the reactive mode more often than I would like to. So with that caveat, I think what you want to look at is, and I've had so many of this experience with different companies, where I have been in ops roles. Some things are reactive when you have multiple people, whether it's sales reps, or your own operations team or partners, or sales finance or marketing, or even sales leaders asking for something. And a lot of times it's probably urgent, or I need to buy, this, or it feels like it's urgent. One trick, which seems so simple, but it's always good to clarify, is first ask, when do you need this by? And what you'd be amazed by is the email or the conversation might come across as urgent. Hey, so-and-so, I need this. Can you help? Instead of reacting right away, ask, great, let's figure out how to help you. Let's start with, when do you need this by? And how much of a priority is it for you? And they will obviously have a point of view, but that will also help you understand how urgent it is. And if it is really, I need this immediately, then you can quickly pivot to say, all right, why do you need this right away? And start recommending, here's probably what it's going to take. So what we can provide you in the time frame you need this by is this. So you can also start thinking about what you can deliver and share that information in the time frame they ask, versus trying to deliver exactly what they asked for. It's technically, if you have been in sales, it's like a kind of an internal negotiation, right? And also helping the requester understand what else you're working on is also very important as part of that conversation. Because what you don't want is misunderstanding, hey, ops isn't really doing anything because I haven't talked to so-and-so in a while. It's more, well, help educate them what else we are working on that they might not even be aware of or care to know about, so that we're not just twiddling our thumbs waiting for all of these asks to come along. And part of it, I think, as ops leaders, and this is a message for those who are in ops leadership roles or who want to strive to be in an ops leadership role, is that ongoing awareness, whether initially and or quarterly or monthly, to highlight to key stakeholders what all your teams are working on, that ideally is aligned to aligned roadmap and priorities. And if there is misalignment, addressing that offline to drive that alignment or clear up any miscommunication or misunderstanding, so that when your teams are tasked with, hey, we need to deliver against these deliverables in this roadmap, you as a leader is also raising awareness with other key stakeholders from groups that have typical requests that hit our teams that might be reactive. And I think that's more important than we give ourselves enough time to do this, even as ops leadership. Because if nobody knows what your team is doing or what you're working on, they're going to presume you can just drop everything and respond to what they need. So it's an internal negotiation requiring some awareness and education of what else your teams are working on, how you prioritize it, and also the simple step of asking, when do you need this by?
A simple step with a big outcome. Yeah, it does seem to me, Yuri, that ops teams often have their own strategic goal, their yearly plans, their own KPIs. But not everyone is super aware of that. And then stuff intersects and interrupts those ideas. So I'm really glad you bring up this awareness point, Yuri. It seems to me a challenge of getting yourselves front of mind into the organization so they're super knowledgeable about what's going on. I mean, no one would ask a rep to drop everything a week before the close of the quarter. So how do you make that a really collaborative process where it's not just we're telling you what's going on here, but
Yep.
you're actually bought into the fact this is important because you've inputted it into some
It's a
way.
very good question. And there's a informal or organic way to do that, as well as a more structured, more formal way to do this. So I'll touch on both of it briefly. The more structured formal way is to set up some kind of a cadence with the stakeholder groups, including your own leadership, which would be ops leadership and sales leadership, and any primary impacted audiences for certain things such as marketing or finance, as an example, right? Or the commissions team, to have a periodic review of here's what's on our roadmap, here's all of the items that we are working on and the status, and any net new requests we kind of manage through an intake process. So if you have a structured formal approach and a cadence to review the status, it can help drive that cross-functional awareness as well as alignment, right? The informal organic approach are periodic one-on-ones you might set up, whether you're an ops person or an ops leader, with your key stakeholder audiences. And this is more of a thought out and planned informal engagement. My calendar, you could argue, is quite filled with a lot of one-on-ones, and they're not a waste of time. Everybody's calendar is quite packed and busy, as you know. And so scheduling a periodic touch point, whether it's every quarter, every month, every other month, some of the meetings could be every 6 weeks, right? Depending on the frequency that makes sense. Just have a one-on-one or a 2-to-1, depending on the objective you want to accomplish in those periodic touch points. Those are great ways to leverage in an informal manner, continue to keep your key stakeholders in those one-on-one, what your team is up to, what are some new things. There may be asks from the team that is a dependency on something that other leader that you might have scheduled a periodic one-on-one with that you can then bring to that one-on-one. And when you're more going productive via remote, right, as many companies are, and you don't have those hallway conversations in offices, these one-on-ones are like scheduled hallway conversations in a way, at a cadence. And my caution is, don't presume email is the only way to solve some of those lack of hallway conversations, because you can get so much more accomplished and drive clear alignment when you're speaking to a person in the phone. And I speak from personal experience, even in the recent months, right? We all have this, where we may have responded very quickly to an email, but then you realize, you know what, I probably should have pinged them on chat or Slack or whatever and say, hey, can you meet? Just like you might knock on a door on a hallway down the hall and just step in and have a 5-minute conversation to clarify something or clear any misunderstandings that they might have been that may have been misinterpreted in an email. And so that informal, organic, monthly or biweekly, however frequent you want it to be, I think is like a hidden tip, right? If you're not doing that, if you don't have enough of those meetings, maybe you should think about scheduling those.
Absolutely, the relationships are so important, especially in ops. The last section I wanted to come into is we discussed this fantastic breakdown you gave between insight providing versus information giving. I'd love you to explain what we mean by that and then why it's important, why that distinction is important.
Yes, so let me first start by maybe kind of clarifying information versus insights.
Yeah.
One way you can differentiate it, if I were to use some data analytics community-based terminology, is information typically is what we might call descriptive analytics, right? So whether it's a report or an email you sent with some data, it's kind of, hey, this is what the data is showing based on a pivot or analysis that we've done. It's a current state. Hey, here's what the data means. Insights is more when you take it to, here's what the data is showing, such as what you might see in a pivot summary, right? X% of revenue or bookings coming from here, blah, blah, blah. Insights is when you're able to add additional points of view drawn out from your analysis and a descriptive, informative information to say, based on this, we are seeing trending here, which might indicate this. Therefore, we might want to consider doing X, Y, Z. So insights is where you might actually provide some proactive recommendation on potential actions to take, or adjustments or pivoting we need to do, or a potential risk area that we need to deep dive into to figure out how do we mitigate. That is different than, for instance, a lot of things we see in the newspaper, let's say, or a blog might be information. This is great information to know. But if you're not going to take that information and actually do something with it, like take action or change something, then that's just information that you know and it's kind of in your head, right? It's like cataloged in your library of information. Insights is when you actually make that information and turn it into something that can be actionable for the person consuming that information, that can change where they are at or improve where they are at. So starting with that, I think it could be as simple as, if a sales leader or an operations leader, if you're an individual contributor in ops, asks for, hey, can you pull this report? And that's their simple ask. We could easily send them a report with a summary of the data that we see. For instance, it could be, can you send me a report of the pipeline outlook that we have for Q3 and Q4? And you can easily send a pivot summary that says, hey, Q3 looks like this, Q4 looks like this. If you were to take a couple of additional steps, back up a little before you send that report, and you say, all right, if I were to ask for that report, I could do another easy clarification. What are you looking to do with this information? What questions are you trying to answer? And the requester responds to you with, well, I'm looking to see this, this, and this. That helps you turn that informational report you were planning to pull from a simple ask, can you help pull this report, into, oh, they want to see the information in a way such that they can themselves translate it into insight to help answer the questions that they have in their mind. Well, let me be proactive and provide them with, well, based on the questions you'd like to answer, this is what the current state of Q3 and Q4 looks like. However, looks like comparing it to year over the past 3 years, we're actually on a downward trend. So we may want to look at what's going on here, and then even make recommendations on, should we go deep dive further into finding out what's going on, or are there recommendations to proactively take action based on your experience? In order to do that, of course, you need to really be familiar with the questions and the business process that question applies to, right? So if you're in an analytics team, I challenge you to really familiarize yourself more proactively in understanding, how does this information help sales, and in what context are they asking those questions?
Okay. Yeah, and that's where we become strategic. It's where we go from being a builder to a provider, insight giver, and change maker. Yeah.
It could be as simple as, right, if you step back and think about an experience, any kind of experience in your life, engaging with somebody, right? For instance, you go to a restaurant, very simple example, and the server comes to your table and says, hey, you know, what would you like to order? And you're looking at this menu, which is information. And my tendency is to ask, what do you recommend, right? I'm thinking about this, but what do you recommend? And they are going to have a point of view. It's like providing a point of view, but based on data and experience, versus just a list of a menu of information that you can do whatever you want with it yourself. If you go above and beyond and share some recommendations and or additional things or questions that you didn't even think to ask, that's really helping you decide yourself, what can I do with that information? That opened up my mind. I didn't even think about asking that question. So compare it to any other experience you might have had. It's not just limited to ops. And then try to apply it to, how can I recreate that aha moment experience for the person that requested this report from me?
Yeah, fantastic. It's the more you explain this, the more symmetry I can see between ops and sales. And I wonder whether there's an argument for adding ops teams into discovery call training.
It's a very good perspective. I think a lot of times sales is our toughest and most critical internal customer, right? So we do have to have some negotiation skills and better understanding what their challenges are. So that's a very good point and observation.
Yeah. Okay, Yuri, appreciate that. Final question then for you. Bit of a silly one, but that's okay. If you're in a room full of the best sales ops, rev ops folks to ever do it, what would you ask them?
If I was in a room full of other ops professionals that were the best at what they do, what would I ask them, right?
Yeah.
It's a good question. I think some of the recent questions I have asked, because I have some connections with some people that I do admire in the ops and revenue ops field that I periodically engage with, is it's more of a kind of two ways you can ask this. One way is, what are critical success factors based on your experience to be successful in an ops role, right? Another way I might ask that in a conversation with a room full of ops experts would be, what was one thing you learned in your operations experience that really shifted the way you look at and approach operations? And the reason why I say this is, as I mentioned earlier, I am still continually learning myself. And also, if you're lucky to have a team that challenges a perspective you bring as an ops leader, or if you're doing ops, you continue to poke holes at an approach that you might have done, been used to doing, and consider a best practice. And so I'd like to understand from other experienced ops leaders, based on kind of mistakes or failures or lessons learned, what are things that from experience, because you had that challenge and you learned from that experience, that you would share, so that others can be more proactive to think about that question in advance versus find themselves in a similar situation where many of us in ops tend to be very kind of, type A personality, want to be very on top of things, right? That you don't see as a failure, but more of as a learning, so that you can learn from it and build on it.